Rosenfarb from Beth Messiah Synagogue, coming to you live from my office at home. I've had a sinus infection now for 3 or 4 days and just can't seem to shake it. I'm getting better and just would covet your prayers and for full recovery. We are talking about the Israeli Arab conflict, and our goals are to answer questions like what happened, how did the Arab refugee problem occur? Who was in the land during the War of Independence, Israeli independence in 1948? And what we've done is we've traced from the first century on to the 7th century. It is very clear that there was a Jewish nation in the land, even after being conquered in 70 CE and 132 CE. The land was filled with Jewish people and Jewish culture, Jewish life, and there was a government, there was a religious institution, a language, several languages, and some borders, and which constituted the land of Israel, which the Romans renamed Palestine. With the Arab invasion, Israel lost her land. The Jewish people, we lost our land, and it was taken over by the then Arabs, who essentially were the nomadic tribes who Muhammad gathered together and built a large army. And through the army and the institution of the Muslim faith, had great success in many parts of the Middle East and eventually the world. What we saw, though, was a quick deterioration of the pure Arab inhabitants, intermarriage with Greeks and Bosnians and Persians and Egyptians and so forth and so on, quickly eliminated any kind of pure Arab. And so even within 100 years, let's say, although I think it was actually less than that, we no longer even spoke of the Arabs as a people. We spoke of Arab-speaking nations, of which there were many. And so the land really increased in Jewish population, decreased in Jewish population, increased in Arab population, decreased in Arab population, and it was not that populated, except for certain times in history. And we saw that the people who actually worked the land were not the Arab speakers, but mostly the Christians and the Jews who knew farming and knew agriculture. This persists. We see even by the 1850s, we see that the land is desolate. The big cities are no more, and very few people in the land, Jews or Arab speakers. But in the late 1880s, we see a great influx of Jewish people from Europe and what we call the Aliyahs, the move to Israel, specifically from Europe, because of persecution there and hardships. And as the commerce increased and the job opportunities and irrigation systems and, sanitary conditions, we saw that mortality rates decreased, age for living increased, children's mortality decreased, and so Arab speakers from the west and the east side of the Jordan River flooded to where the Jewish settlements were, and that's where the numbers of Jewish and Arab-speaking people increased. And so once we have this situation, we now are able to ask a couple of questions. What we're going to do is we're going to take out tonight, and we'll take out next week. I think we'll probably finish next week, and then start reading the book of Habakkuk, because that'll be our next exciting book to say. It's a short book, but a very important book. Some of the sources, that I'm using here for this particular study, Joan Peters, from time immemorial. Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, which is excellent. Numerous articles from journals in what's called JSTOR, which is short for Journal Storage. This was started in 1994 in response to libraries just having extremely high costs for keeping up with journals, new journals all the time. And so it was thought, I think it was a professor from Princeton came up with the idea to at first it was CDs, and then I think that switched to the digital reconstruction of these journals and articles. And that's a rich source for many, many, many topics in the arts and sciences, and I can hardly recommend that. It also is, all those articles are peer reviewed, which is important. It is not pie in the sky. People in the field review the articles before they publish them. So just a couple of ideas to pursue if you'd like to pursue this on your own. So here's the next question, right? We're in at the point where we have the War of Israeli Independence. That's what I'm going to call it. Were Jewish people a minority in what became Israel? Okay, because what people say is that the Jewish state was established in what was called Palestine, despite the fact that the Jewish people constituted a minority in the total population of Palestinians. It's noteworthy that Jews were called Palestinians as well prior to the state of Israel. However, let's distinguish, just for the sake of argument, between the Jewish people in the land in the 1940s, for example, and the Palestinians, which would be the Palestinian Arabs. What they say is that Americans receive most of their information regarding the Israel-Palestinian conflict from corporate-controlled, politically manipulated sources, and they're not really getting the true story. The indigenous population, 1870, 98% of the population was Arab, 2% was Jewish, and then in 1940, Palestinians accounted for 69% of the population, even as the Jewish people thronged from Europe into the area in an attempt to escape the Nazis. 1946 is the year that the UN created Israel without the approval of what they call the indigenous people, which would be the Palestinians. And 1947, we've got 600,000 Jewish people and 1,300,000 Palestinian Arabs. So when the United Nations divided Palestine, the argument is that the Jewish people were 31% of the population. So that means they feel that they did not acquiesce to that. It was forced upon them, and that the state of Israel would be seen as illegitimate because it did not receive the okay from the indigenous Palestinians. All right. So what happens? What happens when we analyze those kinds of numbers, those kinds of statements? Some very interesting things. First of all, in the areas where the United Nations partitioned, remember, they partitioned the ancient land of Israel into two parts. One was the Palestinian state, and the other was the Jewish state. And what is important to remember is that when the UN partitioned the land, in the Jewish partition, Jewish people were a majority. So it stands to reason the way they drew the lines of demarcation had to do with populations, right? So we try to estimate populations. It's not that easy a thing to do, but let's take a look. UN estimates say that the land assigned to the Jewish state comprised of 538,000 Jewish people and 397,000 Arabs. And that number, the Arab number, includes Christians, Bedouins, and Druze, and others. Okay, so these are certainly. Um, it diminishes the amount of Arabs that we're thinking about. Clearly, there's a Jewish majority, and if in fact the Jewish people would have voted, they didn't, but if they would have voted to have such a situation, they would have voted overwhelmingly yes. Right? This is where our population is, and we want a Jewish state. And a Jewish state can only exist where there's a Jewish majority, and so that's what that happens. In terms of division of the land, the Jewish state looks more like it looks larger in terms of land than the Arab state, except that the Jewish partition also included the Negev, and the Negev was deemed unusable and undevelopable, at least at that time. So when you take that into consideration, you can't you do see that the Jewish state is not larger than the Arab lands. We see that the Jewish land was largely swamp and desert. They made it into gardens by irrigation and farming techniques. The Arabs were Transjordan, which is basically Jordan on the west side of east side of the Jordan, plus Jerusalem. That was all the part of the Palestinian domain. You hear my guard dogs. All right. So Jerusalem had a Jewish majority, but was under Arab rule, and with a Jewish population of 100,000, and it was going to be internationalized, but cut off from the other Jewish areas. So you have a Jewish area, and then you have a middle section, so that the areas, in a sense, are cut off from one another. But the Jewish people jumped at the opportunity of having a Jewish state. Hebron, which was one of the four most holy sites in all of Israel, was given to the Arab sector. And there would be no Jewish presence in that at all, despite that Jews had lived there for thousands and thousands of years, until the massacres occurred in 1929, 1936. Jewish women, children, and old men were driven out, and so no Jewish presence was there at that time. All right. So Tel Aviv, all of these areas would be easy targets for military action. And so you can imagine the tensions were very, very high. Tel Aviv could be cut off very, very easily. It's a narrow wasteland between it and the Arab Dominion. Could easily be isolated. All right. So nevertheless, Israel quickly said yes, acquiesced to the UN resolution, and the Arabs rejected it, and which is really a sad thing. It led to it led essentially to the Arab refugee problem. We'll see that in just a bit. All right. By the way, a Palestinian state was again offered to the Arabs in year 2000 at Camp David, and again rejected by the Palestinians, and they responded by suicide bombings. Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here's the real issue. Okay, when all is said and done, we recognize that the Jewish partition had a majority of Jewish people living in it. Okay, so there's a majority of Jewish people living in a Jewish state. Israel announces its nationhood, and of course, immediately, what follows. So, what is the accusation? The accusation is Israel created the Arab refugee problem. What are they saying? The state of Israel was established by a settler colonial project that was sponsored by different colonial powers for different reasons. It was not possible to establish, as the rationale, a Jewish state in Palestine without expelling the indigenous people. Now, they're saying they are the indigenous people. We've already shown that in the 1880s and onward, the Arabs came in to the main stream of what was called Palestine. So they were not the indigenous people by any stretch of the imagination. But this is where they're coming from, right? So the rationale is you can't start a Jewish state unless you expel the original inhabitants, right? The indigenous people. When in fact, during the Arab takeover, the Arab conquest, it was the Arabs that were the colonialists, and it was the Jewish people that were the indigenous people. But be that as it may, all right. So the War of 1948 was a war of dispossession, is what they're saying. What happened that year was the destruction of Palestinian society, the replacement of that society by another, and the eviction of those who were considered undesirable. Those were in the way. And so Yitzhak Rabin, they say, evicted 50,000 inhabitants of Ramla and Lida. And so they say, look, this is obvious that the Arabs were dispossessed, in fact, by the Jews. The Palestinians were only responsible for being there. The Israelis did engage and want to continue to engage in ethnic cleansing. I'm sorry, this phlegm. And that rhetoric has persisted, in fact, until this day. The Zionists, they call Israelis the Zionists. The Zionists claim that Arab leaders told the Palestinians to leave. This is not to be believed by anyone. No one even claims this anymore. Now, I've mentioned Benny Morris, who is a well-known Jewish historian. He's a Zionist, but he has been very critical of Israel's policies in the 48 war and other things. And he's written about them. And some of his writings occur, in fact, in the JSTOR's volumes. They're easy to access. Some of them you have to pay for. Others are in the public domain, and others are free. You'll have to check that for yourself. All right, Benny Morris has shown that the Arab population was driven out by the Israelis. Now, the guy that comments on this is also a scholar, a Palestinian American scholar, Noam Chomsky. And what is the reality? The reality is the Arab refugee problem was initiated by the Arabs. And the short story is, by precluding a Jewish and Palestinian state and by mandating war and losing the war and refusing to assimilate Arab refugees, and we'll talk about how they fled and why they fled, refusing to assimilate them, they are put into refugee camps, not by the Israelis, but by the Arabs. And then what? Then it becomes Israel's responsibility, because they won all this land. They won all this land in the war, and now they're going to have to take care of all of these refugees. Had they accepted the Palestinian Jewish state, the Arabs that wouldn't want to live in the Jewish state would have migrated to the Palestinian state. The Jews that did not want to live in Palestinian state would migrate to the Jewish state. Arabs who wanted to live in a Jewish state would remain, and vice versa. Okay, so in essence, by refusing the partition and mandating the war, the Arabs created uh, this this refugee problem. That's the reality. This war against Israel in 47 and 48 by the Palestinian and Arab armies took land from the Palestinians, and again, this created the problem, right? The Arab armies tried to kill Jewish civilians and did, in fact, massacre many who tried to escape. The Israeli army, by and large, allowed Arab civilians to flee Arab-controlled lands. For example, here's an example. When the Arab legions, 6th Battalion, this is well documented, conquered Kfar Etzion, they left no Jewish refugees there. The villagers surrendered and walked hands in the air into the center of the compound. Benny Morris reports that the Arab soldiers simply proceeded to mow them down. The soldiers massacred 120 Jews. 21 of them were women. This was the part of the general Arab policy. Jews taken prisoner during convoy battles were generally put to death and often mutilated by their captors. It's just documented. It's nothing we have to make up. These are not fallacious sources. These are prima facie sources. It is precisely because the Arab army, unlike the Israeli army, unlike the Arab army, did not deliberately kill civilians, that the refugee problem exists. If they were to slaughter the Arabs who fled, there'd be no refugee problem. But because Israelis did not, as the rule, do that, you have live Arabs fleeing to nowhere. And these refugee camps are created. The Arabs simply did not open up, except I think Jordan did not open up their borders, but kept these Palestinians in these terrible camps. And Israel had to eventually come in and spruce them up and make them better, really. Take care of the sanitation, the food, the clothing, and so forth and so on. All right. December 1947, March 48, during attack by Palestinians before the invasion of the Pan-Arab armies. According to Benny Morris, the Yishuv, the diaspora are the Jews outside of Israel. The Yishuv are the Jews within the land of Palestine, that is Israel. The Palestinian Jews would become Israelis. Was on the defensive, and the upper and middle class Arabs, as many as 75,000, fled. Morris describes how families that had the means to go to Cairo, Amman, Beirut, they did so expecting to return after the violence, like in the 1930s. There was the same kind of upheaval in the 1930s, the Arab revolts against the British. And they left, and then when everything was settled, they came back. They thought they'd do the same thing. After this war was over, they would come back. The Israelis would be gone. The Jews would be gone. And it would be Arab land, Arab controlled. So among those who left the land, by the way, the Arab Higher Committee was founded in 1936 in what was called Mandatory Palestine under British rule, 1920, 1948. And the League of Nations had mandated the area of Palestine, and the Arab Higher Committee was the committee of the that was in charge of this, along with the Haifa National Committee. So guess what happened with them? They took off as well. They left their people behind. They took off in hopes that they would come back to a cleaned up Palestine. All right. So he points out that there was the conflict, the Jewish-Arab conflict, really was part of a more general breakdown of law and order in Palestine after the UN partition resolution. Right, public services collapsed after the British withdrew. If anybody's ever seen, I'm not saying it's a totally accurate picture, but Lawrence of Arabia, you see what happened when the British took over. When the British left, no one could run the public facilities. No water, no electricity, no power, no sanitation. It was just a mess. Right. So Arab, look, it was not a good situation. So that's the first refugee problem is created by these people leaving and people in disarray. And what are we going to do? The leadership is taken off. What are we going to do? The second refugee problem began when the Haganah is the official arm of the Jewish army. And it's called the Army of Self-Defense, began to gain the offensive. In other words, they began to win unexpectedly. Between April and June of 1948, Haifa and Jaffa were captured by the Israelis, and a domino effect occurs with the flight from cities, you can imagine, leading to flight from surrounding villages and flight to other villages, and all of a sudden, they are gone. So contrary to Noam Chomsky's characterization of Morris's conclusion, he does not believe that Arabs told Palestinians to leave. Morris actually says in his writings that in some areas, Arab commanders ordered the villagers to evacuate to clear ground for military purposes or to prevent surrender. Right? They didn't want Arab villages surrendering to Israel and offering comfort to the Israeli army. They didn't want that. They also wanted to clear the battle arena for the victory that they certainly thought was going to happen. More than a dozen villages just north of Jerusalem and in the lower Galilee were abandoned because of such orders. In East Jerusalem and many villages around the country, the Arab commanders ordered women, old people. These are on radio broadcasts. These are on pamphlets. These are in Arabic papers as part of the historical records. The British have archives that contain these things. The Israelis have archives that contain these facts. Right. So all right. So he says between 2,000 and 3,000 Arabs fled their homes during this phase of the Arab initiated fighting. This is all contrary to the other view that there's no such thing as Arab leaders telling their people to flee. So Morris notes that during the first phase of Arab evacuation, there was no Zionist policy to expel the Arabs or intimidate them to flight. Although it's clear that many Jews were happy to see this. They saw this as part of the lack of fighting. It's something they didn't have to deal with, and they were happy to see them leave. I'm sure that is true. But during the second stage as well, when the Haganah began to exercise victories in many areas, he says there was no blanket policy of expulsion, but the military actions of the Haganah certainly contributed to the flight. You can imagine the Arabs seeing the Israeli armies advancing and not wanting to be around for that. Okay, so I'm sure that was that is documented, as a matter of fact. This occurs. Flight from battle occurs if the winning side allows it. Well, the Israelis allowed it. They allowed the flight. Arab armies would not allow Jewish flight. I've already reported what happened to most of those people, right? The Israelis did not kill the people running away. So these became part of the larger group of Arab refugees, right? There's little doubt that if Arab armies captured Jewish villages, they did not and would not have allowed civilians to flee to other Jewish cities. It was not their policy. It was not their practice. They would have been massacred, and in order to prevent a creation of a Jewish state. The Grand Mufti, who was the religious leader of Arab Palestine in Jerusalem, declared a holy war and ordered his Muslim brothers to murder the Jews. I mean, that's what it was. He said, murder them all. There would be no survivors. There would be no refugees of Jews, right? The position of the Grand Mufti had always been that of an Arab Palestine, that an Arab Palestine could not absorb what was then 400,000 Jews. Okay, that was not going to happen, and it couldn't be. By 1948, the Jewish population, as I said, was 600,000. Extermination, not the creation of a difficult refugee problem, was the goal of the Arab attack on Jewish civilian populations. That's just the reality of it. As the Arab League General Secretary Abd el-Alman Azza Pasha candidly put it, this will be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. I don't know how much clearer you can get. The Grand Mufti's spokesman, Ahmad Skurkawi, I think that's how it's pronounced, called for the elimination of the Jewish state with regard to the goal of the Arab attack. There was no talk or planning for a large Jewish refugee problem in the event of an Arab victory. It does not matter how many Jews are there. We will, here it comes, we will sweep them into the sea. You want to know what from the river to the sea means? This is what it means, right? From the river, Jordan, all the way to the Mediterranean, no Jews. That's what to the river of the sea, to the sea means. I think Christians need to understand that. Jews need to understand that. From the river to the sea is exactly what the Mufti in 1947, 1948, and his spokespeople, that's what they were saying. Doesn't matter how many are there. We will wipe them all into the sea. Later on, the PLO is going to say the same thing under Yasser Arafat. So we'll sweep them into the sea. By the way, you can read Benny Morse's book, Righteous Victims, published 2001, where he documents all of this. And Vintage Books is the publisher. Lots of conclusions that you may or may not agree with, but he documents these statements, these kinds of statements. The Jewish people fully understood that they faced what? Slaughter should they be defeated. There's no question in Jewish minds. And because of the Holocaust, they were determined that this not happen. Israel was prepared to extend full citizenship to whatever number of Arabs remained in the Jewish state. And that is quite the opposite of what we see in the Arab mind here. There was a sense in the Jewish mind that there could be an idyllic Jewish state with a Jewish majority where Arabs, hopefully in the minority, could live as full citizens, full partners, if they remained loyal to the goals of the established state of Israel. All right. Many Jews surely preferred a smaller number of Arabs, but nobody stipulated it, right? Israeli military commanders did order evacuations of hostile towns, right? And several bases for Arab irregular units, which prevented access to the main road. They certainly pushed them out. Anything that was a threat to the Israeli army's advance pushed them away. They did also, because Israel, generally speaking, throughout its history, has not been a country or a non-country, before it was a country, that believed in collateral damage. The United States and Israel are the only two countries in the world that believe that. And so Israel would give the Arabs a chance to leave before their village was attacked, before their village or town was in the midst and the heat of battle. It was not the policy of the Haganah to encourage the flight of local Arabs. If there was a military reason, that's one thing, but wholesale get out of your town, that was not their policy. It was the policy of two paramilitary organizations, the Irgun under Menachem Begin and the Lichai, or the Stern Gang, headed by Yitzhak Shamir. On April the 9th, 1948, paramilitary units fought a very difficult battle for the control of Deir Yassin. This was a very important Arab village on the way to Jerusalem. The battle was fierce with the Irgun and the Lechai forces. Again, these are extremists forces. They lost more than 1/4 of their fighters in this battle. The Jewish fighters were pinned down by sniper fire and threw grenades through the windows of many of the houses where the snipers were firing. Most of the villagers eventually fled. A car, an Irgun armored car with a loudspeaker, demanded that the remaining villagers lay down their arms and leave their houses. Benny Morris reports that the truck got stuck in a ditch and that the message was not heard. The fighting continued, and when it was over, 100 to 100 Arabs were dead. Many of the dead were women, because Arab fighters dressed up as women and shot Israelis to whom they had surrendered. This is a tactic that's had been used by the Iraqis in 2003. Now, some of the reports say that this was actually a massacre, that the Israeli, the Irgun and Lichai forces, again, this is not the Haganah, but that these forces actually massacred men, women, and children, right? And women and children were also, they were killed. The question is, how were they killed? How do you read the reports? Which reports are credible, which reports are not? That's difficult to say, but clearly everybody had an interest in calling this a massacre. And why, right? The Arab side wanted to discredit the Jewish people by arguing, quite hypocritically, in light of their own policy over the decades of deliberately massacring civilians, that the Jews were worse than they were. The British wanted to discredit the Jews. The Irgun and the Lichai folks wanted to provoke terror and to frighten the Arabs into fleeing. The Haganah wanted to tarnish Irgun and Lichai. The Haganah and the Jewish Agency immediately condemned the massacre and those that participated in it. A formal note of apology was an explanation was sent to King Abdullah, and indeed this massacre contributed to the decision by David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, to disarm by force these paramilitary organizations in June of 1948. But the effect of Deir Yassin and the publicity surrounding it was clearly to provoke even more flight by Arabs. They were afraid to be massacred. Okay? When confronted, then some Palestinian leaders actually circulated false rumors. These were false rumors that women had been raped. And when confronted with the reality that no rapes had taken place, Hussein Khalidi, a Palestinian leader, said, "We have to say this so that Arab armies will come to liberate us from the Jews." Okay, right? It didn't happen. Hazan Nusaybi, a journalist at the time, told the BBC years later that the deliberate fabrication of the rape charge was our biggest mistake. As soon as they heard that women had been raped at Deir Yassin, Palestinians fled in terror. It created more flight and a greater population for the Arab refugee problem, right? It stands out in history, in the history of the Arab-Jewish conflict, uh, precisely because it was so unusual. It was out of character for the Jewish people to do anything like it. Even though they condemned it, the fact that Jews were involved in it gave Israel really a black eye, right? But no single Arab massacre of Jews has this kind of status because there's too many to list, right? Every Arab school child, everybody that speaks out against the Jews knows of this story. Sorry. Nobody mentions the massacres at Hebron, Kfar Etzion, Hadassah Hospital, Safad, and the many other well-planned Arab massacres of Jews to come, except extremists proudly take credit for them, right? And no outrage there in the Arab communities. The Arabs retaliated for Deir Yassin, not by attacking those responsible for it, perpetrating it. They didn't attack the Irgun, they didn't attack Lichai, these extremist paramilitary groups, but rather they deliberately committed premeditated murder of their own in a well-planned attack 4 days after Deir Yassin. Arab forces ambushed a civilian convoy of doctors, nurses, medical school professors, and patients headed towards the Hadassah hospital to treat the sick, murdering 70 of them. Now, the way this is explained in Arab literature is that supposedly, it's not true, but prior to this, Arab policy was not to target civilians. But after this massacre, they changed their policy. Okay, that's the way it's explained. We already know of the many massacres that occurred before all of this, right? So, to ensure there were no survivors, the Arab attackers doused the buses and cars containing the medical personnel with gasoline, setting them alight. No apologies, no excuses for this carefully planned massacre of non-combatant medical people, right? Nothing. So they went after. Yeah, okay. I don't need to say any more about that. All right. Yes. Okay. Here's just a little anecdote. According to Benny Morris, the Arab leaders in, I think it's Haifa, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just check on that. Yeah, April 1948, Haifa. The Arab leaders, preferring not to surrender, announced that they and their community intended to evacuate the town, despite a plea by the Jewish mayor that they stay. Similarly, in Jaffa, this is all documented. The fierce fighting with many Jewish casualties caused a panic among the town's Arab population, and many fled. Morris writes that the behavior of Jaffa's Arab military also contributed. They looted the empty houses and occasionally robbed and abused the remaining inhabitants. I'm not trying to say good Jews, bad Arabs. I'm just saying the histories are so different, and the cause of the Arab refugee problem is becoming quite apparent. These were Arab causes, by and large, with few exceptions. The Arabs themselves pushed the refugees into the refugee status. When Ben-Gurion visited Jaffa after the fighting had died down, he wrote in his diary, this again is Benny Morris. He wrote, I couldn't understand why the inhabitants leave. Why didn't they stay? If they saw that we were winning, they know how we've dealt with them in the past. Why did they leave? Jaffa remained an Arab city. Its population today, of course, includes thousands of Arabs. Haifa remained a mixed city. It includes thousands of Arabs. Other towns and villages from which the Arabs fled remain mixed till today. And he says the Palestinian refugee problem was born of war, not design. The Arab leadership inside and outside Palestine probably helped precipitate the exodus. No guiding hand or central control is evident. You understand what that means? The Arab leadership inside and outside Palestine. Now, this is a guy who is critical. He is a Zionist, an Israeli historian, but he is he's from his research, and he's part of the group that's called the New Historians, who are reading documents that were hitherto not available. And the Israeli government released these particular documents, and they're studying them carefully. But despite all of that material that's now available, he and others would say the Palestinian Palestinian refugee problem was born of war, not design. The Arab leadership inside and outside Palestine probably helped precipitate the exodus. No guiding hand or central control is evident. It's just the way things happen. Clearly, the Arabs were not looking out for their own people. They could have assimilated them in other Arab countries, as people groups have been for centuries upon centuries. Morris says, during the first months, the flight of the middle and upper classes from the towns provoked little Arab interest. It took this kind of exodus to get people to take note. All right, I don't need to. Let me say this. All right. People who like Noam Chomsky, I mentioned him before. He looks at Morris's work, and he says that Morris says he places the entire blame on Israel, right? And the truth is that Morris does not conclude that at all. I'm not going to say it's a purposeful misreading, but it is a total misreading, a total 180-degree opposite reading of what people have published, right? Morris, like other historians, and unlike Chomsky, finds shared responsibility for the creation of the refugee problem, concludes that neither side deliberately caused it by design, but that the Arab leadership inside and outside helped precipitate the exit. Okay, so he says Israel had a hand in it by moving its army and moving it forward. Were there people who thought that the Arabs should vacate the land of Israel? I'm sure that there had to be that kind of thinking among some, but there's no document. The British have, in their investigations, have no document, no written literature. The Israeli government has no literature of any kind of final solution. I don't mean the extermination, but I mean the Arab problem, Arab refugee problem, the Arab problem that existed in the land of Israel during the war of independence for Israel. It just simply doesn't, it's not there, right? So what are people doing? Are they making it up? I mean, it must be. It must be generation after generation after generation. These stories are circulated over and over and over in this particular way. That's how they get distributed, right? Since 1948, we have, the Israelis are the ones that demanded the return of the refugees, right? And the Arab refugees were made by the Arabs to be beggars, to be humiliated, to be despondent. And so the stories within their own groups are fueled and fired by Arabs on the outside, especially. Look what the Israelis did to you. You were the original inhabitants. They kicked you out. When you have that generation after generation, then that's what you're, in fact, going to believe. So it's a very, very difficult, still a difficult situation. Let's see what I want to do. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is stop here, and I want to. Oh, here's an interesting anecdote. I will say this. A research report by the Arab-sponsored Institute for Palestinian Studies concluded that the majority of Arab refugees were not expelled, and 68% of them left, get this, without seeing an Israeli soldier. How can they have been coerced by the armies of Israel if they hadn't even seen an Israeli soldier? 68%, that's a high percentage. All right, we'll stop there. I'm going to talk about the numbers of the refugees and some of the things that happened, the definition, a unique definition only given to the Palestinian refugees and not to other refugees of other countries. I'll sum this thing up next week, and then we'll go into the book of Habakkuk. I'm sorry I have this sinus infection. Keep praying for me. I appreciate it. And I hope to see you Saturday morning at 9:30. Rabbi Derek will be giving his Torah study, and then we'll have a service at 10:30. Kadima and Israeli dancing and the Hebrew class. All of that will be on Saturday, right? Be in mind of our Seder coming up. You can see that online, and you can sign up for tickets. You have to get tickets online this year. All right. So take a look at that. They're going to go fast, and Passover is upon us as we speak. Right. God bless you. I hope this has been enlightening to you, and we'll sum it up next week. Get into the book of Habakkuk. So start reading that book. It's not a long book, but it's a very important book. Okay. See you next time. God bless you. Shalom.